Picture a tiny, luminous creature, no larger than a wildflower hovering effortlessly in a sunlit forest clearing. It has the proportions of a human, delicate gossamer wings, and a mind capable of complex thought, language, and perhaps a touch of ancient mischief. This is the classic fairy of European folklore, popularized by Victorian illustrators and modern animation. It's a beautiful, comforting image that has endured for centuries, deeply rooted in our collective imagination. But if you were to actually place this creature into our physical reality, it wouldn't flutter gracefully or offer cryptic wisdom. Instead, in a matter of seconds, it would suffer a violent, catastrophic biological collapse. The laws of physics and biology, which are entirely indifferent to our mythologies, have carved out a reality where a tiny winged human is not just unlikely, but physically impossible. To understand why, we have to look at how scale dictates the rules of life on Earth. And the place to start is with the most fundamental, inescapable law of biophysics, the square-cube law. First formalized by Galileo, this mathematical principle dictates that as an object scales down, its surface area decreases by the square, but its volume, and therefore its mass, decreases by the cube. If you take a standard human and shrink them down to a height of 5 centimeters, they don't just become lighter, their entire relationship with their environment changes dramatically. Because their masses decrease so much faster than their surface area, our hypothetical fairy now has an absurdly high surface area to volume ratio. To a creature of this scale, the ambient air is not a neutral background, it is a giant heat-sucking sponge. A warm-blooded mammal scaled down to this size would lose body heat to the environment at a rate that is difficult to overstate. To avoid freezing to death in a temperate forest, the fairy would require a metabolic rate that dwarfs even that of the shrew, a mammal so small it must eat its own weight in food every single day just to survive. The fairy's heart would have to beat thousands of times per minute, requiring a constant, uninterrupted stream of highly concentrated energy. It wouldn't have time for magic or woodland revelry. It would be locked in a desperate, 24-hour-a-day struggle to find and consume nectar or sugar just to keep from dying of hypothermia before sunset. But even if we assume this creature somehow solved the thermodynamic problem, it immediately runs into a second, equally brutal physical barrier: the fluid dynamics of flight. In classic folklore, fairies are depicted with elegant, insect-like wings that beat gracefully, allowing them to glide and hover like miniature birds. But fluid dynamics tells us a very different story. To an organism measuring only a few centimeters, air does not behave like a thin, transparent gas. Because of a physical ratio known as the Reynolds number, which measures the balance between inertial forces and viscous forces, the air at that scale feels remarkably thick. To a fairy, flying through the air is less like a bird soaring through the sky and more like a human swimming through a pool of cold maple syrup. Insects survive and fly in this viscous regime because they don't rely on the aerodynamic lift that birds or planes use. Instead, they use highly specialized, incredibly rapid wing movements, such as the clap and fling mechanism, vibrating their wings hundreds of times per second to create miniature, chaotic vortexes that literally drag them through the air. A vertebrate skeletal and muscular system, even scaled down, simply cannot support this kind of motion. The muscle fibers required to beat wings at that frequency would generate so much friction and heat they would cook the surrounding tissue. And the delicate bones of a humanoid shoulder joint would be torn apart by the sheer mechanical stress of the vibrations. Then there is the problem of the brain. Fairies are almost universally depicted as highly intelligent, sentient beings capable of speech, memory, social structure, and complex decision-making. But intelligence requires physical real estate. The human brain contains roughly 86 billion neurons, packed into a highly complex three-dimensional network. If you scale a human down to fairy size, you have to do one of two things with their brain. You must either reduce the number of neurons or shrink the neurons themselves. If you simply reduce the number of neurons to fit inside a skull the size of a pea, you no longer have a sentient talking creature. You have a brain with roughly the cognitive capacity of a housefly or a small lizard, capable of basic reflexes, hunger, and fear, but utterly incapable of language, culture, or conscious thought. If, on the other hand, you attempt to shrink the neurons themselves while keeping the overall network intact, you run headfirst into the hard limits of physical chemistry. If a neuron's axon becomes too thin, specifically less than about zero point 0.1 micrometers in diameter, the electrical signals traveling along it become highly unstable. The lipid membrane can no longer reliably contain the electrical charge, and random thermal noise begins to trigger spontaneous chaotic firing. The brain essentially short-circuits, rendering any form of coherent thought or sensory processing impossible. When we look at how nature actually solves these scale-based challenges, we see why the fairy archetype is a biological dead end. Hummingbirds, which are the closest real-world equivalent to a tiny, hovering vertebrate, have had to make extreme evolutionary compromises to exist. They have abandoned almost all mammalian traits. They have a heart that beats up to 1,200 times per minute. They must enter a state of near-death hibernation called torpor every single night to avoid starving in their sleep. And their cognitive abilities, while impressive for their size, are strictly hardwired for foraging and survival. They do not have spare cognitive capacity for language or abstract reasoning because their brains simply cannot afford the energy or the space. In the end, the fairy is a beautiful impossibility because it attempts to combine the biological luxuries of a large, warm-blooded, highly intelligent primate with the physical scale of an insect. The laws of nature do not allow us to pick and choose our physical constraints. The very same principles of thermodynamics, fluid dynamics, and neurology that allow us to exist, to think, and to write stories about fairies are the exact reasons those very creatures could never step out of the pages of our folklore and into the real world.